Well, thanks for those who have stayed for the second talk. The second talk is a very special one for me because I'm introducing an ex-colleague working with while I was at CBA. On a less serious note, he has two main skills that I would say. The first one is that he can brew very good beer. He has been upskilling his skills there. Started from ginger beer, but now he has expanded his portfolio. So congratulations on that.
Thank you, Jose. Yep.
When are we trying some of it? When are we trying some of your beer?
I'll bring it in next talk. Okay. Yeah, enough for everyone, guys. I expect you all here. Yeah.
For 200, we here. Okay. Thank you. And the second great skill that James has is that he was making everybody enjoy more working at CBA, because every Thursday, at any moment during the day, he was sending us an email with a riddle. It was a very complicated problem, some data science, maths, combinatorics, or just something to think about deeply. And we had to solve it by the day after. So on Friday, he was sending us the solution and declaring some champions of the contest.
I think you won a couple of times.
And that was really fun.
Yeah.
I think that's why I got some beer or something. So yeah, let's get back to the most serious part. So James is an associate data scientist, a very talented one, working at CBA. He's working now in very interesting things that he cannot discuss deeply. But before that, he has been involved in this project, Financial Wellbeing, where he has been collaborating with the Institute of Melbourne, that belongs to the University of Melbourne. And what they are doing there is trying to put together two views of the customer, customer finance well-being. One, the one the customer declares, and one, the one that the bank observes. They are trying to combine those two into a more informed one, so that the bank can help also the customers to do better and well, help you improve in your financial situation. So I'm really looking forward to see this new version of the talk. Yeah, please, the stage is yours.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Jose. Thanks all for coming out too. I would absolutely like to start with a thank you for our team down in Melbourne, the Melbourne Institute. This whole thing would have been impossible without them, and there's too many people to thank, but particularly David Ribar, who led the team down there. Phenomenal work. I encourage anyone to work with him. We also have a big team here at CBA. I think Andrea Nicastro, I'm going to embarrass you. Are you in the audience? He's up here at the back, has also been a big part of this project, along with several other people at CBA. So I by no means want to take all the credit for this. So what I want to go through today is measuring financial well-being. You probably figured that out by now. But we're going to treat it as sort of from go to woe for creating this scale. And we're going to step through it. So I'm going to start by showing you what the end result is. We're going to see where we ended up at the conclusion of the project. And then we're going to take a step back to the beginning and retrace our steps to how we got there. So it's not all going to be data science, but data science will definitely make an appearance. So in terms of financial well-being, before we even start to talk about what it is, it's really important to notice the indelible influence that this has on our lives. Can determine the opportunities that we have open to us. It can affect us in ways that we do like, ways that we don't like, positively, negatively. It can be obvious, it can be subtle. But at the end of the day, it's something that we really can't afford to ignore. And it's absolutely at the core of the CBA vision to understand this and to be able fundamentally to try and improve it. So the role of this project was in figuring out how we even know if we have improved financial well-being. If we're not sure what it is and we're not sure how to measure it, it's very difficult to say this is the steps we've taken to improve it and this is how much we've improved it by. So that's why the aim or the overall goal of the project is just in measuring financial well-being. So I said we're going to start by actually looking at the conclusion of the project. So this is a nice little interactive component. You'll have to get your phones out to do it. But if you just open Google, Chrome, whatever you've got on your phone and search FWB score, the very first result, follow the links to that, and we're going to check out our reported financial well-being scale. There are some instructions in there, some T's and C's. The link down the bottom will take you through to the survey. But I'll give you all 2 minutes to do that.
What are you going to do with the data?
We're gonna come to all of this. This data, oh sorry, this specific data isn't tracked, it's all anonymous. Yeah. Unfortunately, the volume's not working. There's meant to be a little backing track to this, but that's okay. So. While you're all doing this, I'll hit you with a riddle now, if you like. Jose definitely set the stage for it. This is a hypothetical, so I don't actually have any children, but in this hypothetical, let's assume that, first of all, gender is binary, and then I give you the following statement. I have 2 children. One is a boy born on a Tuesday. What's the probability that the other child is a boy? So hypothetical, obviously. I have 2 children. One of them's a boy born on a Tuesday. What's the probability that the other child is a boy? I'm hearing a couple of 50%. I'm sorry, no.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Sure, so imagine I have 2 children. One of them is a boy born on a Tuesday. What's the probability the other child is also a boy? Also wrong.
Sure.
Like a fair third guess, but I get the feeling you guys are just guessing. It's somewhere between 0 and 1, I can tell you that. It looks like a lot of you are still at your phone, so I might give you an extra 30 seconds.
50%.
You're at 50%, all right. You've got to focus, Patricia. Get some hustle going.
25%?
Oh, you're guessing the probabilities still?
Yeah.
We'll come to the probabilities at the end. I don't want to distract you all too much from the presentation. Give you all some time to think about it. Plus, if someone gets it now, they've ruined it for everyone else. All right, I'm hoping a couple of you have gotten your scores now, so I might move on to the next stuff. But the structure of the scale is quite straightforward, as you can see. The reported scale is based off 10 questions. Each of the 10 questions has sort of 5 responses that might be in there. And they're all built on the sort of questions that you would expect to be in a financial wellbeing scale. If we're trying to gauge whether we think you're financially well off, whether your financial wellbeing isn't so great, these are the sort of questions that you would think people are going to ask. But the route that we get there is a lot more quantitative than you might think based on your current interaction with it. So first of all, let's take a look at what the distribution of scores look like. As Jose mentioned, we've actually got 2 scales. So what you've done so far is the reported financial wellbeing scale. And you can see the distribution of that, which we've broken up into some categories. We have a second scale, the observed financial wellbeing scale. We're also going to take a look at that. If you've got a score in front of you, one thing you might notice is that the score on its own, interpreted in a vacuum, is relatively useless. It's much more helpful to interpret it like in a broader context. And this is why we have the descriptive categories that we've put on top of the scale. So it just ranges from having trouble, just coping, doing okay, and doing great. And your experience with the reported financial wellbeing scale will have put you into one of those and said, based on your responses and how you compare to everyone else, this is where we think you place on the scale. So all I'm hoping at this stage is that you have an understanding of what the result of the project is. So what I want to take you through now is the steps that we took and the process we went through in order to produce the reported financial wellbeing scale and the observed financial wellbeing scale. So we break it into 4 general rough steps. And not shown to the left of the screen is just a sort of literature review and research step. So once we've done that, our goal is just to conceptualize and define financial wellbeing. And this sounds incredibly abstract and like not quantitative for what we're doing. But we're going to see why it's really critically important to really pin these down, because we're going to be working with sort of latent variables. And to understand that they mean what we want them to mean, we have to be able to tie it into a really thorough and rigorous conceptual framework. In addition, a lot of the research, we're not the first ones researching financial wellbeing, I should say. So our definition is based on previous research. And a lot of the questions that you actually just answered in your reported financial wellbeing scale, those are taken from other people's research. Like, taken collaboratively, this is how research works. And it has the added benefit of helping us actually align our scale to existing scales. So one of the nice results here is that we take other people's research, we've developed it, we've built it on it, and now we can take a look at what we've added to it. And of course, one of the big things we've done is be able to add the bank record data. As far as we're aware, we're the first people who've been able to do this. And we've done it at a customer linked level. So at the very beginning, we had a bunch of customers fill out a survey, and we tied those survey responses to their banking data, anonymized the whole data set, and that was the data that we worked with for the scale. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the collect data stage. So once we have all of that data linked at a customer level, that's when we proceed to the modeling stage. And as you can see, that's sort of halfway through the whole process now. But we're going to pick up this modeling stage. There's going to be a few subcomponents of that. But the really key meaty bit is going to be an IRT model, which stands for an item response theory model. And we're going to do a quick little rapid intro to that one as well, because I certainly didn't know what it was. And then the outcome is the actual financial wellbeing scales, which you've seen. And we're going to take a look at some of the conclusions that we were actually able to draw out of the financial wellbeing scales, having created them. So financial wellbeing, we had to come up with a definition. So we define it to be the extent to which people both perceive and have the ability to meet their obligations, the freedom to make choices, to enjoy life, control, and security. And we say that that's both now, in the future, and under adverse circumstances. CBA also has a sort of simplified model. Sometimes we say financial wellbeing is every day, one day, and rainy day, which talks to the financial wellbeing just for day-to-day obligations, financial wellbeing where I'm saving for my future, and financial wellbeing under shocks and financial stress. But this definition is sort of the atom from which we build everything out. So this is just the definition. The extension of the definition is to build a conceptual model of how all of these different bits of financial wellbeing relate. So there's a lot of information on this slide. What I want to focus on is the headings in each of the 4 boxes. On the left, you can see we've got household characteristics and external conditions, and they're quite far away from the box on the right, which is the financial wellbeing. Our key interest is in financial wellbeing, and what you'll notice in there is that they're all outcomes-based items, and this is absolutely critical for our scale. We want to build this scale strictly using outcomes. Outcomes being actual, observable financial wellbeing components. So it excludes all behaviors, it excludes demographics, and any other sort of auxiliary data. And so as a result, we've really limited the amount of information that we can build this scale on. It makes the whole task a whole lot harder, but it's absolutely necessary if we want to use this scale in order to determine which behaviors lead to good financial wellbeing, does changing this behavior improve financial wellbeing, and questions like that. So we have to really narrow our focus on these outcomes and strictly build the scale on those so that the scale can be used for all the purposes that we want to be using it for. So it makes it a much more broadly applicable use tool than an index which takes in all available information. So that's sort of our first step. That's our definition and our conceptual model. And from here, we're going to start looking at those outcomes. And we're going to think about ways that we can actually measure them. So each of the questions you answered in your reported financial wellbeing scale, each of those were measuring outcomes. We can take each of those, tie them into the conceptual model, or tie them into our definition of financial wellbeing. And we can say, these are the areas we think it's measuring. Is it one day? Is it rainy day? This is how we think it ties into our overall model. And like I said, without being able to do that, we have no way of justifying that our actual end result is measuring what we think it's measuring. So the conceptual model is really critical. The next step that I mentioned was going to be a data collection step. So as you've already figured out, this was based on both bank record data and survey data. The survey was sent out to a couple of 100,000 individuals. I think we got a 3% response rate. Sounds low. I'm told that's actually quite typical for the problem, so that's fine. We had 5,500 respondents altogether, but we had to reduce that down a little bit. So 4,470 was the overall customer base that we were working with. And we captured then, or first defined, a bunch of outcomes that we thought we could measure using data available to CBA. And data available for all customers, because we want this scale to also be scalable. Two different interpretations of the word scale there, but we want to be able to use this scale for all individuals after having researched it on this small set. So here are the 5 outcomes that actually made it into the final observed financial wellbeing scale. We worked with around 20, I think, but these were reduced for various reasons, which we're going to see in some of the modeling steps. So cash relative to expenses, I'll talk through these briefly. Cash relative to expenses is a one-day measure, an everyday measure, which just gauges the proportion of time that you could have covered 1 week of your expenses on a typical day in the last year. Payment problems is a composite measure, which aggregates sort of mild problems that occur rarely, such as a dishonor fee, for example, or maxing out your credit card, up to really chronic and extreme problems like ongoing arrears or an inability to pay your loans back. Inflows versus outflows is a measure looking at the relative sizes of money coming into your account and money going out of your account. So it's based on the number of times that you spent less than 80% of all money coming into your account, which also implies you're saving 20% of all of your inflows. Savings relative to age is a really interesting feature, actually. So unfortunately, a savings balance is good for financial well-being, but we can't use the same scorecard to determine what a big savings balance is for a 50-year-old and a 20-year-old, for example. So we have to come up with a way of age normalizing this, and the way that we do that is by running a median regression with spline predictor variables defined in terms of age. So just to clarify, we capture your age, and that's the only input to predicting the median savings balance of these customers. But what that means is that we get a regression that uses just 6 variables, or 9 perhaps. So it's really easy to then communicate this to other researchers who can then replicate the results on other data sets. And we then take your residual compared to what we think the median should be at that point. And the difference between the two we quantize, which gives us a measure of how big your savings balance is relative to people similar age. Cash and credit relative to expenses is the last measure. It's very similar to the first one, except we look at a longer time span of expenses, and we also consider all available credit that's open to you. So credit limits, for example, or redraws on your home loan. Before I go on, I don't want to push through this too fast. Does anyone want to jump in with a question? Anything to clarify? Yeah, all right.
Gender and family composition for saving relative to age?
So yes, absolutely. It would be probably adverse to the overall scale if we predicted your savings too well. If it turns out that, say, all people with brown hair just had more savings than anyone else, we would actually like the scale to reflect that. So what we don't want to do is to find groups that might have lower savings balances than the rest of the population and artificially inflate that with a regression that takes it into account to give them better scores. Because as a result, the scale would then miss these vulnerable groups, which we absolutely wouldn't want to do as a final outcome. If we're using this to decide on interventions and actions that the bank can take to help improve financial well-being, we actually want to capture differences in financial well-being. Great question. You probably weren't expecting the answer though. Thank you very much. Anyone else want to jump in? Mm-hmm.
$500,000 loan. How do you take that? Do you just look at the cash balance and offset account?
Yes, this is part of a bigger problem, which we sort of termed partial visibility. So in general, the bank has a big problem in that we're not the only bank. And on top of that, if a customer has what we call a split MFI status, so a main financial institution is CBA, but they have products with other financial institutions, we don't know about those other financial institutions, and any money that's leaving your account, we don't know if that's going to your account somewhere else or somebody else's account somewhere else. So this is something we struggle with, and this is why we limited to MFI customers. And we then, on top of this, actually, I might come back to this a little bit later because we're going to see some things, and I'll talk to how we accounted for the fact that there might be differences in the population that we couldn't see.
How would you deal with this rather unusual case? I know one man, he's a very poor man, but his father is extremely rich, so he's just waiting until his father dies. How would you deal with that?
Tough question, and I've got like a couple of things that I should address. So one of them is we want this scale to be universal, robust, and applicable to all Australians. So taking into account sort of niche edge cases, we don't want to diminish the overall applicability of the scale to make it account for these interesting sort of side cases. So we consider it a helpful tool, but not a comprehensive one. So we don't want to take these into account too much. Secondly, this is an extension of the partial visibility problem where this person has more information beyond their immediate banking data that we can't capture. And in addition to both of those, this is also why we capture the reported score. So the reported score allows people to bring in all of their exogenous knowledge that they have. It's self-normalizing. People can compare themselves to their peers. So that's part of the information that gets captured in the reported score that isn't captured in the observed score. And we're actually going to see how that difference plays out in the data that we observe. And to further answer your question, we do see, so on a manual inspection, looking at people who have really different reported scores and observed scores, we do see that it's often cases like this. It's also often people with small businesses and immigrants who are sending large amounts of money home. These people will often have really different reported and observed financial wellbeing scores. All right, so At this stage, we've done our conceptualization, done our definitions, we've done our data collection, which at all data collected is a measurement of the outcomes of financial well-being that we've gotten from our conceptualization. The modeling stage follows a sort of hypothesis that financial well-being is a latent underlying driver of all of these outcomes that we can actually observe. So the first thing to test this is an exploratory factor analysis. So to talk through this plot quickly, maybe not too quickly, there's a lot going on. First of all, apologies for the variable names. There's a lot of information there and a lot of history behind them that we won't go into. The top 10, all of whose feature names begin with an S underscore, are survey items. The bottom 5 are all observed outcomes or bank data outcomes. And what you can see next to the top 10 is that they've all got big orange bars next to them, whereas next to the bottom 5, the observed outcomes all have big blue bars next to them. So what this is telling us, we've run a factor analysis. This is the two-factor outcome specifically. We ran other numbers of factors as well. But we can see that all of the survey data are loading really confidently onto one factor, and all of the observed data are loading really confidently onto another factor. So this is actually, this is the reason why you just did the reported financial well-being score and it didn't have any of the observed financial well-being score in there. This was a data-driven decision. It wasn't a convenience decision for us. We would have actually much rather it if all loaded onto the same factor. But the data absolutely drove us to the position of having two scales. And that's what we're seeing here with the orange and the blue. So for those who aren't overly familiar with factor analysis, it's essentially telling us that with maybe like a two-dimensional vector, we can explain most of the variation in all of these observed outcomes. In this case, we don't force the vectors themselves to be orthogonal either. So the orange factor and the blue factor actually have a correlation of around 45%. So it's also telling us that the reported outcomes and the observed outcomes are reasonably correlated, but we can explain almost everything in the reported data using just the underlying factor, and we can explain a lot of the observed data using just the underlying observed factor. And those two factors themselves are related, but knowing the reported data and the reported latent score, or the reported latent factor, learning the latent factor for the observed data doesn't help us anymore, which is why we have two distinct scales. The fact that like orange independently is up the top and blue independently in the bottom, that's our decision to make two independent scales. The next step is the IRT, and I promised you like a rapid fire intro to what an IRT is. So thanks for Ruan for the introduction to probabilistic graphical models, because this might look familiar to everyone here tonight. On the left, we've got a yellow circle with a theta. That's our financial well-being. So I said our hypothesis is that there's this underlying latent driver of the outcomes that we can see, and that's what theta is. The y values in squares are our observed outcomes, and epsilons are error. So in this model, we're assuming that our underlying financial well-being is driving the outcomes, along with a bit of error in the observation. And so all we have to do is start to capture what these relationships might be. So assume for simplicity that each of these y values are binary. All we have to do is build a logistic regression from theta to y. Having built this logistic regression, we've got a probabilistic relationship. So then based on any set of y values, along with a prior on the theta, thanks for Ruan, we can work back to what we think the maximum a posteriori estimate is for theta. And this is how we measure financial well-being for people. So as long as it fits into this IRT framework of an underlying driver for observed data, we can fit an IRT model to it, and we can start to capture some really rich information about how these outcomes relate to one another. You will have noticed also that all the responses you put into your reported financial well-being score were ordinal. That's like a trivial extension. That's not a problem. And the actual fitting process is just done through expectation maximization. And it converges quite rapidly to a good estimate of all of those regressions. So to take a look at, I don't want you to just believe me that this is a good model. What you're looking at here is the actual relationships between theta, that underlying financial well-being, and then each of the curves correspond to one of the responses for each of these questions. So what we're really hoping for is nice distinct peaks. Each of them should have a sort of region of the scale at which they're most likely. And we can see for all of these that is indeed the case. You'll notice for payment problems here on the left in the middle, there's only 4 curves. You'll also notice that those curves are actually a little bit flatter and wider than each of the other curves. This is why the observed financial well-being scale only goes from 0 to 19 and not 0 to 20. We were forced to collapse 2 of the levels together because they just didn't have the nice peakiness that we require from the 5 response levels. So it's essentially telling us that there just wasn't enough difference between people who had a few not so bad payment problems and some moderately bad payment problems. There wasn't enough distinction between those two groups, so we have to collapse them. And the IRT is able to give us all of that information. We can get more out of this as well. You'll notice that at the top right, we've got net spend. The peaks there are skewed a little bit to the right, as in like the central peak is to the right of 0, whereas payment problems is the opposite. That's skewed further to the left. This exactly corresponds with our intuition. If you're deep in arrears, you're right down the bottom end of financial well-being. That's a really chronic problem. Whereas net spending is really quite an aspirational one. If you're managing to save 20% of your income every single month, we expect you to be right up the top of financial well-being. And that's what we're observing when we see these two sets of curves living in different areas on the scale. So this is why the IRT is really informative and manages to sort of condense a lot of information for us. It also serves the convenient purpose of sitting inside a sort of ongoing tradition with economists and psychologists. So people in that industry are quite familiar with the process. They can interpret the output really nicely. And so we managed to slide into the existing research much more smoothly. This is sort of the conclusion of the model stage. I might reach out for questions again briefly. Does anyone want to jump in here? Yes?
Sorry. During university and when I was job hunting, I was on the government support payments, and I knew I tried to sort of practice save, have that 20%, and each year predictably the ominous letters saying you're a bloke under 30, you've got car insurance due, and then every time it would flatten out pretty much all my income.
Mm-hmm.
How, I guess, would somebody who is doing that, the responsible say they are trying to, due to their people with such limited funds, and I guess, that was maybe, it could be anyone sort of who goes through a period of unemployment, or illness, how would that graph for that look in those situations?
So the graph itself won't change, because what we're looking at here is like that logistic relationship between the underlying feature and the observed outcomes. But what we'll see for those people is that their position will change. So if you have a low outcome on the net spend, so you're sitting on this red curve here, working backwards to that theta estimate, yes, you are more likely to drop, and it's sort of exactly what we want the scale to do. So even if you're aware of maybe insurance policies, friends that can help you out, an economist would tell you friends and insurance policies are the same thing, but that's a lonely perspective. We do actually want it to cause a drop in your financial well-being, and that is what we see. Interestingly though, these actually confirm what we realized from the survey responses, which is that people tend to give all responses or have all responses for the same questions. So it's very rare to see somebody with 1, 5, 1, 5, 1, and it's very, very common to see people with 3, 3, 3, 3, 3 all down the line, or say all 3s and 2s. And that's evident here where we can see that all of these curves cover almost the whole scale. So as a result, it's a very edge case actually to see somebody drop down in just one measurement rather than all of them. They tend to drop across the board. I'm not sure if that's answering your question. Okay, you can come see me after the show. Sir?
What's the scale?
So the scale is that underlying theta, and the prior that we put on it is we assume that it's normal. So what you're seeing here, ranging from -4 to 4, is actually way out at the tails of that normal distribution. Yeah.
How do you deal with, for example, noise of, say, someone trying to go through the survey multiple times, trying to game it to see what different outcomes would bring?
So for the survey that we actually sent out to these customers, it was they got to do it once and then it would lock off. And it was, we worked very hard at choosing the messaging the right way. So first of all, we have to put in all the ethical considerations to say, look, none of this is tracked. You're helping Australians' financial well-being. We even had a comment that said, once you finish the survey, you get to elect a charity and we'll donate some money to that of your choice. So there's not much we can do if people are sort of adversarially biasing our data, but we had very little evidence of that in what we saw.
Right.
Was there another question?
Yeah, I've got a quick one. So this is sort of QA, like just confirming that your analysis approach was suitable for the data. Did you actually make any change to the questions though, based upon the outcome of this?
Interesting question. So the questions no, because the survey went out as a one-time thing, and most of the questions were aligned to existing research. And as in, other people have done surveys on financial wellbeing before, and they asked questions that word for word were what you've seen in your reported financial wellbeing score right now. So we're really reluctant to change those for two reasons. One, anything that we learn about those questions is less relatable to questions that might have been asked if we've adjusted the question. And two, item response theory models have this really nice quirk where any two scales that have an overlapping number of questions, we can actually align the two scales and create a mapping from one to the other. But if we start changing the wording of different questions in that scale, we lose that ability because we're not sure that people are answering it in the same way. No worries. So the fourth sort of area that I said I was going to talk to you about was just things that we've learnt about financial wellbeing. So I'm not going to go into too much detail. A lot of this is available on the internet, so you can look at it. But there's one finding that I personally really like. So one of the first questions people ask is, what about income? How does my financial wellbeing change as my income increases? And the answer is yes, your financial wellbeing does increase as you get more income. But what we really love is that almost across the board, your behaviors are much, much more powerful at driving your financial wellbeing than your income ever is. So what we can see here is that moving from $20,000 of income to $100,000 of more income gives you a considerable increase in your financial wellbeing. So that's the top diagonal that you can see there. And the slope of that diagonal is sort of showing the strength of just the pairwise correlation. But the second one here is just, do you do a good job of balancing your spending and saving? And we can see that your response to that is a far stronger measurement of your financial well-being than your income is. So this is sort of it's a really positive thing for us for one thing, because income is difficult for us to change, but we can design a bunch of interventions to help people change their spending and saving behavior. And so this is really promising for the bank in the sense that we believe more strongly than ever before that we have the ability to help people secure this financial well-being. And this sort of result holds up when we do multivariate regressions, lasso regressions, pairwise or seemingly unrelated regressions. The magnitudes may change, but overall the message is really, really strong that your demographic, your household context, and your external context do influence your financial well-being, but much less strongly than your behaviors, attitudes, and capabilities, which is a really promising result for us. So we've actually released a couple of reports. If you want to read anything about that, just search Financial Wellbeing Melbourne University, and I think it'll be one of the top results on Google. So you're more than welcome to do that. But other than that, I'd like to thank everyone for coming. And are there any other questions that I can answer while I'm up here? Sorry, maybe get some microphones out too. Cheers.
We have one question here.
Yeah, just on the slope on the last slide, is the slope you said shows the strength. So you want a flatter slope or a steeper slope?
The closer it is to horizontal, the stronger the relationship. So here, if you do no job at all of balancing your spendings and savings, median financial wellbeing there is 28 or 44. If you do a good job, it's 75 or 78. So the difference between the first row and the bottom row there is massive. Yeah. No worries.
All right, so now that you've been able to detect within a certain level of confidence what financial well-being is, how has that then been translated into business strategy for CBA, and what actions have been taken as a result of these findings?
So there are absolutely questions. This is no longer my domain, so I don't want to venture out and start talking about things that I shouldn't, because I'm going to do a bad job of it, right? But absolutely it is in the works. I'm sorry I can't give you much more than that.
More questions?
So actually follow up from the other question is that, so have you been thinking about what intervention you may actually introduce to nudge these people to move to a well-being? And is the plan to be able to follow up with the effectiveness of these measures? Or is that...
So yes, absolutely to both. They are using it to think about what the most effective sort of interventions are going to be. We also, because we built it on outcomes rather than behaviors, it means that we are able to use this as outcomes in randomly controlled trials, if that's something we want to. Because we consider it to be a sort of expansive and robust and universal outcome measure, it's a really powerful way of testing the effectiveness of interventions sort of for everyone, covering a whole lot of different things. Again, though, I'm not the right person to speak to about specifics about exactly what we're doing, and I don't want to do a bad job of explaining them to you, so I'm sorry about that. Yeah, no worries. Who we got next? Jose?
Yeah.
Yeah?
So far, what seems to be the case is we tend to think that if there is more income, then it tends to contribute towards the higher level of financial well-being. But my question is, there is another input. There is a individual's philosophy and the lifestyle. If someone suddenly changes attitude towards their life and then adopts more frugal lifestyle, then with the same level of income, that person will be able to save a lot more. Yeah, and then it will certainly change the financial well-being while the income level stays the same, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. So yes, having a higher income does give you a stronger ability of being able to move yourself on the financial well-being scale. To extend to that, generally we find these scores are very, very sticky, partly because they're built on 12 months worth of data. So you sort of have to wait 12 months to even reduce just the built-in correlations there. But on top of that, these are built on really long-term behaviors, and they're outcomes focused as well. So if your goal is to increase your savings balance, it takes a long time. Thank you, sir.
In your observed data, did you only look at transactional data, or did you also look at application data, or even like public data that's like credit ratings?
We looked at, yes, many sources of data. So application data is in there. Any data that people have sort of given to the bank as a part of a financial health checkup as well. We looked into all of this. We looked into what we could about super balances as well. A lot of it wasn't as good as we wanted it to be. There's also, for item response theory models, because each of the relationships are just a logistic regression, so I'm going to talk to you about missing data for a little bit, because the problem with application data is not everyone has it, obviously. So item response theory models handle nulls really well, because the whole thing's just a Bayesian thing, so given a subset of the observations, that's fine. We can still work backwards to get a posterior distribution for our financial well-being. The problem is, though, that assumes the data is missing at random, and if we're looking at application data in particular, absolutely not the case. So as a result, we'll have information in the missingness that item response theory models can't handle. Where the information, of course, is that people with higher financial well-being have a higher capability and a higher tendency to apply for credit products. There were several items that we didn't quite get in, so credit card behavior data, for example, or not behavior data, but the outcomes of how you pay your credit card balance off very nearly made it into the scale, along with the proportion of your income that was spent on interest payments to non-home loan loans. In conclusion, yes, we did try lots of these. The problem with a lot of them is the missing at random problem.
All right, thanks for a great presentation.
Thank you.
You made a lot of connections between earlier research and the research that's been done here. Given the results that you've got, what are the similarities and what are the differences between the earlier research and what you found?
So the similarities are mostly focused on the reported financial well-being score. So we had the luxury of sort of choosing from a bunch of people that have done a bunch of surveys. So we took our pick of all our favorite survey questions from them. We actually had, the original survey was 30 minutes long and several pages. Thankfully, you guys didn't have to do that tonight. So we had questions from every single survey that we could find, and we put all those ones in. Almost all of them tested well. And our results aligned really strongly with everything that existing researchers had found, both in terms of the strength of connection and where on the financial well-being spectrum each of them discriminated. The big extension for us was including this observed financial well-being score. So no one else has been able to do this yet, and it's truly interesting for us to be able to see how the two relate to one another.
Sorry, I was referring to the actual outcomes, the data that you collected. What were the differences between the data that they collected versus the data that you collected?
Oh, largely the population. So most of the previous surveys were overseas, which does affect things, for example. So people's responses to questions about superannuation vary really strongly from country to country because the programs vary really strongly country to country. Are you talking also about like these ones, like finding out? Yeah.
So what's the population of Australia's comparison with whichever other countries were using the same questions and the same results?
Most of the other places haven't done this detailed analysis. We've really pushed it in terms of figuring out really the strength of the association between each of these in a variety of ways. So I think the broad answer is it agrees with everything they've done. The more detailed answer is we've gone into more detail than anyone else has, so I can't tell you exactly how it related.
have one more question, the most important question of the night.
I knew it was coming.
What is the solution of the riddle gave us before?
The answer is 13 over 27, Jose.
Repeat again?
It's 13 over 27.
Explain a bit the logic.
Do we want an explanation now?
Of course.
So this is built on a previous question that a lot of you have probably heard, which is, I have two children, one of them's a boy. What's the probability that the other one is a boy? And in that case, the answer is 1/3. I'm going to use this pen and paper, guys. We're going to do some real-time maths here. So assume that up the top I have child 1 and down the bottom I have child 2. I'm so sorry for the people down the edge that can't see this. This is a 2x2 grid with boy, girl, written over it. And I've told you that one of my children is a boy. So I can immediately cross out this third square because that's where I have 2 girls. Looking at these 3 boxes, each of them are equally likely, and in only one of them, my other child is a boy. So that's why in the case where I say I have 2 children and one is a boy, what's the probability that the other one is a boy? I get 1/3. When we add the additional information that one of them is born on a Tuesday, and I realize how frustrating this is and how mad it makes everybody, but if you can imagine adding a day of week, so Monday, Tuesday, ... Saturday, Sunday, we now live inside these 2 narrow lines. So that's sort of 14 days this way and 14 days that way with 1 day of overlap. And the probability that I have a boy, my other child is a boy, lives exactly in these 13 squares. So 13 out of 27. That's not my problem, by the way. That was invented by somebody much cleverer than me.
It seems you have more girls and boys.
So this is why we live in the happy hypothetical world where we assume, first of all, gender's binary, and secondly, that boys and girls are equally likely.
You haven't covered the edge cases of twins yet.
I haven't got... You know what? I suspect that this would apply to twins as well. Oh, maybe not. Maybe identical twins are more likely. Happy hypothetical, no twins exist in this world.
Let's leave it here. Thank you, James, for a fantastic talk.
Thank you very much, Jose.
Hi, Greg Pearl from Northbridge IT Recruitment. Just hope you enjoyed tonight's presentations. I've been sponsoring the Data Science Sydney meetup for the last 6 years with regard to videoing all of the presentations. Just a heads up, if you're looking for any past presentations, please go to the Data Science Sydney YouTube site. There would be over 30 to 40 various presentations. I think it'd be good to go back and catch up on. Northbridge IT Recruitment, specialist IT recruitment firm, working across government, large corporates and startups. Personally, I focus on the data area, specifically data science, machine learning and artificial intelligence. If you'd like to speak to me about individuals who are looking for their next role, please reach out, make contact. Any organisations looking for their next data superstar, please give me a call. There's plenty of really good people out there at the moment, and I'm very well networked in this marketplace, so I can definitely help. I look forward to seeing you at the next Data Science meetup. Please don't forget, look at the YouTube channel for those past presentations, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.